folks, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. My name's Dan Lizette. So happy you came back and take a listen once again. Got a very special guest this week. But this week's show is made possible by listeners like you, those few, the proud, my Patreon supporters. If you really love what I do here with the Podcast Digest, I would really appreciate you going check out the link in the show notes for Patreon if you guys would like to keep the show going. This week's show is also brought to you by... guess who? You guessed it. It's Podbean. Go to podbean.com/TPD. You'll learn more about the wonderful service, and you'll get your first month free. It's the easiest way to start podcasting, folks. I'll tell you a bit more about Podbean later on in the show. But let's get to this week's show. This is one that I haven't done, but maybe one other time. I think I've had a reappearance of guests before on things like my recommendation show, but I don't believe I've had a reappearance of a guest for a second interview, and I am doing this now. This guest of mine, folks, I've talked about this before, and I've got to be honest, as most people probably know, oftentimes I have to unsubscribe to things, right? I mean, this is episode 118. I've featured a lot of shows. I've listened to a lot of shows, but to be able to keep bringing you guys all these interviews and reviews and recommendations, sometimes I have to unsubscribe from stuff, even stuff I truly do love. However, since featuring this gentleman way back on January 18 of 2015, way back in episode 21, I am still subscribed to his show and listen to it every single time a new episode drops. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the Podcast Digest, Dana Buckler from How Is This Movie?
Good afternoon, Dan, and I can't even begin to tell you how humbled I am by what you just said there. Thank you so much. It's a real honor and a real treat to be back on the show. I think my relationship with you goes back almost to the beginning of your podcast, and I have just been in awe and bewilderment of watching how big your show has grown. So congratulations to you, first and foremost, and thank you so much for having me on.
Well, I appreciate it, Dan. It's great to have you back. I was so happy to find your show from the get-go. You were part of that first expansion of me from my regular sports and tech shows that I had been a huge fan of for years and years. And as I started to expand, I came across your show at social media somehow. I don't remember how I first found you. And I know we shared stories about how I had even played it for my family at one point. And the great job you've done has only gotten better over these last couple of years. In fact, your 3-year-long show now, and we'll talk about your anniversary in just a bit, but episode 21 was way back, right? So that would have been, what, you about a year and a half in at that point?
Yeah, that would have been, November. I think it'd been about a year and 3 months. Yeah.
Great. So a lot's happened since then. Just a 30,000-foot view. If you could kind of give all the Podcast Digest listeners an update on the life of How Is This Movie since we last touched base.
Since we last touched base, I have been... I don't even know how to really begin. That's a great question. That there's been so much that has happened over the past 2.5 years since we've chatted. I think one of the biggest things that I've learned from doing the show over the past time that we've talked is just how much is out there. I have had a chance to talk to some of my favorite filmmakers. I've had a chance to talk to some of my favorite podcasters, and I've had a chance to share my never-ending passion with film with so many more people, and it's just been awesome to keep doing it. So I don't even know where to begin.
Well, you talk about shows growing and changing over time. I mean, I think How Is This Movie is a great example. I mean, at the very beginning, it was sort of retrospective historical backstories to great films. But you just touched on a lot of things that have really changed. You've brought in a huge amount of interviews with a lot of big names, right? You've had guests that you've basically brought out their story. I'm thinking about Annalise with Skywalker Sound. Yeah. And then even better, and the one I really like to highlight, and I think I said something to you on Twitter a few months back. Here's the thing that I never saw coming with How Is This Movie? And I think that you've actually evolved into a spectacular storyteller at this point.
That is something. Thank you, by the way. First of all, thank you very much. The first time I told sort of a personal story goes way back to October of 2014, when I talked about my experiences with a childhood phobia of Freddy Krueger. And I told a story about being in Universal Studios at age 20 and running into what I thought was a wax figure of Freddy Krueger, only to have it come to life and start chasing me through the park. And unbeknownst to me back then, I didn't realize, but that story got a lot of feedback. Throughout the show's history, I've started to tell more and more personal anecdotes that somehow relate to the movie in question. And I've also continued my movie theater stories. Even though I don't really go to the movies too much anymore, I still manage to pull out a story about once every 3 months. But the personal anecdotes that I've told seem to get the biggest reception. So much so that I'm actually planning a couple episodes where it's just me telling the personal stories without the movie in question.
Yeah. No, I think that would be great. And, it almost makes me wonder, and we were having a little chat before hitting the record buttons this afternoon about time and how much time neither one of us seem to have nowadays. But it almost seems like I wonder if there's like a whole nother show there, a whole nother line, like just from your storytelling, whether it be yours or taking somebody else's, story. I'm thinking about some of the shows like Lore and Myths and Legends that basically, they're writing a story in advance and sort of narrating it and telling that story. It almost seems like that you've got a great delivery on your stories, Dana, and whether it be a personal anecdote or I would bet you could even have an ability beyond that. But it's all interesting in a infinite time scale, right?
Well, it's interesting because I've been kicking around the idea of doing a podcast called The True Story of Dana, which is, obviously it's very tongue-in-cheek, and it is sort of basically telling amusing anecdotes that have happened to me throughout the years. Obviously not necessarily movie tie-in related, but I feel like I sat down with pen and paper, and I think I wrote down about 15 or 20 different stories that I could tell, which I think would have the same effect as the ones that I tell on How Is This Movie. So I'll tell you, Dan, it's something that I have been strongly considering.
Oh, great. And if that were to happen, I think that would get a lot of great reception because it's weird because I think most people probably come to your show for a movie fandom, right? I mean, obviously it's in the title. Right. Exactly. And maybe the particular topic of that episode is one that they're interested because they love that movie or want to know more about it. But it seems to me that in often cases, there are other things that people are attaching themselves to. What has it felt like when some of these other things that you didn't think would end up being a highlight became, topics where people give you so much feedback and complimentary, information about? What's that felt like?
Oh, I'll start by saying it's been really awesome and also really humbling at the same time. I recently got an email from a lady in Australia who just told me that she only listens to my show for the personal stories, and would I please do more personal stories? And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, I've really opened up this can of worms now. Like, I need to keep this thing going. And I'll be honest with you, the pressure starts to get to me a little bit about, right. okay, what story can I tell with this movie? I'm starting to pick movies now based on personal stories that I can tell. Like, I have a Smokey and the Bandit episode planned out, which involves me maybe taking my brother's Firebird for a joyride one Saturday afternoon, and hilarity ensues. But it's interesting now because I mentioned to you 2 years ago that I had a list of 25 or 30 definitive films that are always going to be covered on the show. Like these, no matter what movies I do, no matter what guests I interview, I'm always going to do these movies. Well, I've gone through a good portion of that list. But now it's like, well, what stories can I tell? Well, that story's really interesting. What movie could I tie that into? So, yeah, there's been this sort of monumental shift towards trying to tell many more personal stories. But the feedback has just been awesome. And again, if you would have told me 2 years ago when we talked last that, hey, you're going to be known more for your personal stories than the film history, I would have been like, well, what are you talking about?
But are you good with it, Dana? Like, does it feel okay? Does it feel like you've come across something and now you're happy that you got something to kind of play upon? Or does it feel like, well, people didn't really get what I wanted them to get? Or how do you feel about all this? Well,
I feel like there has to be that perfect balance. There has to be a perfect balance between the story I tell and keeping to the sort of the roots of the show itself. So I'll give the Deliverance story, the Deliverance episode, give that as an example. That episode is perfectly timed to where half of the episode is a personal anecdote and the other half is the history of the film. And I purposely made that equal parts. I really don't want one to be longer than the other, although that's not been the case with past episodes, but that's sort of the shift I'm trying to go towards. So, yeah, I mean, I'm okay with it. I'll be honest with you, and I have no problem saying this. I've even thought about rebranding the name of the show, to be honest with you, because it's
I was going to bring that up.
It's not really, the show's sort of evolving into something different. And I recognize that now. And so, the question becomes, well, how do you rebrand it? Do you lose the people that were in it for the movie history?
Right.
There's a big question mark there. And to be honest with you, I haven't really talked about this with anybody. So, since it's just you and I talking.
Yeah, nobody's listening.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I mean, this is sort of the quandary I find myself in right now.
It's interesting because when I had that thought too about when we talk about original goals versus sort of how things evolved, and I've told this story as well about my own show. I mean, anyone who has been around since the beginning, and there might be two of you because I think that's how many people listened in the first 5 episodes. I was just doing podcast recommendations. I would talk about 2 shows, and I was even given like app recommendations, around listening to shows, and I was doing all kinds of funky stuff at the beginning, and it evolved over time into now what I've got is a pretty good system of 8 to 10 interviews. Then I break and I bring on a co-host for a recommendation show, then another 8 to 10 interviews, then I break. And so, but it took this much time to sort of find what I'm comfortable with now as a rhythm and an output for the Podcast Digest. And it sounds like now you're going through a similar process, or maybe on the down end of it, where you're starting to find a formula that is striking a chord.
And that's exactly it. And it's I'll give you an example. Like, I'm currently working on the next episode that will be released for How's This Movie is going to be on the Titanic, the James Cameron's Titanic. Mm-hmm. And I've just spent, I don't know, I think I spent 12 hours researching the actual history of Titanic, White Star Liner, what it was like to travel a transatlantic voyage across the ocean, and I realized that I've got probably a 90-minute show with no personal anecdote attached to it. And so
you're getting scared now. It's like,
so it's like, wait a second. Well, I've never even been on a cruise ship. I mean, how am I going to tell a story with this one? But I have to be true to, the amount of work I've put into this particular episode. And so I hope that when I release this episode without a personal anecdote, that people will still respond well to it, because I think it's going to be a really good show. And it's chocked full of a lot of history, not just about the movie, but the actual, what happened to the ship, the people that were on it, the company behind it. I mean, I've learned so much that it was one of those research sessions, Dan, where I was excited just learning all about the history.
Right.
And I hope that this will translate well into an episode. But, fingers crossed, we're going to see what happens.
So here's the question. You a fan of Titanic, the movie?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. I want to make sure, because I too am, but I've caught flack for that. I imagine you probably have as well.
I think if anyone who's listened to my show knows that I'm a big James Cameron fan, and I don't think the man does much wrong in my book. So I think Titanic, it was eclipsed by Avatar as the highest grossing. Avatar became the highest grossing film of all time. Prior to that, it was Titanic, and I thought that was really well deserved. I thought the 11 Academy Awards that Titanic won were well-deserved. I think Cameron deserved everything. So I'll defend that movie to the bitter end.
Yeah, I think it's from those who look at it as simply a love story. But I think there's so much more to it. And it's one of my favorite movies. I thoroughly loved it. Saw it in the theater when it came out, and I'm a big fan.
Yeah, no, I think that it's a masterpiece. I mean, it's one of those films that when I saw it in the theater, and there's a funny little theater story attached to one of my episodes about seeing the movie in the theater, but we'll save that for another time. But when I saw it in the theater, I think I was maybe 19 years old when it came out, and I don't think I was really that amped up to see it as a 19-year-old because, Leo and Kate Winslet and a love story, and my jaw was on the floor by the time the movie was over. I was just so blown away about it. So yes, but I really hope that the information that I convey to people in this episode that I'm doing, without a personal anecdote. This is sort of going to be the test. I want to see what kind of response, figure out what happens. But I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I've never looked at the personal stories as a requirement. I've always looked at them as a sort of silver lining, icing on cake type thing. Like, wow, I didn't come here looking for that, but now that I've seen that, it's one of my personal favorites. When you do it, I don't think it becomes an episode by episode requirement per se. And that's just my take.
And it hasn't been, because in some cases there is no story to tell. I didn't do a personal anecdote about the cable guy, even though I think I mentioned that I saw it in the theater, and that when I left the theater, everybody was sort of scratching their heads going, what was that? I mean, what was that film we just saw? And I think, the only thing I really talk about with that episode is that how throughout the period where I got older and I rewatched the film, I fell in love with it. And that's why I did an episode on it, but there was no personal anecdote there. So, and that was a very popular episode, I might add. Just on a statistics number, that was amongst one of the more downloaded episodes of this year. So, there is some tracking data to suggest that I can pull it off without a story.
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight that element of it because, and I hope it doesn't become to a point where you are forcing it or you feel like it's required, because I don't think that's the magic that got it to its high esteem at this point. It was when it occurred, when it felt natural, when you had that gangbuster tale to tell, rather than something that was forced or a requirement. So I think if you can keep it in that lane, it will continue to be a hit.
I think that's the formula right there. I think you just nailed it. I mean, I'm my own worst critic, and I think everybody who's a everyone that's a content creator is probably their own worst critic. So, if I have to ever force a story, then I'm just not going to do it. Because if it doesn't just flow out like, hey, this is what happened, this is how it went down, this is the moments that I thought were really funny, then you're right, there's absolutely no point in doing it. Yeah. I will say this though, and this is by the time this episode airs, I will be releasing a special Thanksgiving personal anecdote about I'll give you just a little teaser here, and that is growing up in Canada, Thanksgiving is not near the big deal it is here in America. They celebrate Thanksgiving in early October. It's just a one day. It's on a Monday. It is not the huge holiday weekend that it is here. So when I moved to the United States and sort of got my first taste of traditional Thanksgiving dinners and family get-togethers, I was sort of blown away by it. And this story sort of focuses on one of the worst Thanksgiving experiences I ever had, meeting a girl I was dating's parents on Thanksgiving. And I'm going to leave it at that, because I will tell you this, everything that could go wrong that day went wrong. So just that's
you seem to have a lot of those situations.
My friends tell me, a lot of my friends tell me that I should just drop the podcast and just write the book. Just go ahead and write the book. Yeah. And I don't even know how to tell you, but I have found myself in some of the most unique situations through just pure circumstance. Just happened to be there and something happened. Either it happened to me or it happened in front of me. And it's just, I've been lucky to make it to 38 years old. That's all I'm going to say for right now.
I feel the same way very often, let me tell you. Before we move on from How Is This Movie, because there's a couple other topics I want to touch on as well, but I wanted to talk about, since the last time we touched base, obviously the show's grown, the audience has grown, the feedback obviously has grown and changed, especially like we were just discussing with the stories. Anything stand out in your mind over the last, almost 2 years since you last were on this show, that were maybe turning points, certain celebratory crossroads, or maybe even a time when you were like, I'm not feeling this anymore. Any of those feelings in the last couple of years?
Well, let's handle that point by point. First, I'll start by saying that there's never been a period where I felt like the show has run its course.
That's good to hear.
That there's always been that there's always been a moment where I've said, okay, this is where I think I want the show to be at. And then after about 2 weeks, I'm like, no, the show needs to evolve. I constantly want to evolve the show into something. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure if I've completely found it, but I think I'm never going to be satisfied, but that's sort of the drive that keeps me going. I always want to try to produce a better show each and every time. And sometimes and again, I'm sure many podcasters listening will relate to this. There's sometimes that I'll release an episode and I'll literally kick myself going, you could have done a better job on that. You could have done a better job. And then the feedback on it would be really good. But, so there's no rhyme or reason on what's going to, take off. You mentioned a turning point. If I could, I'd like to share with you, I think, one of the biggest moments that happened to me for my show that couldn't have happened without my show. So we need to go back to early 2000 just to give some context here. This is a time before video on demand and, easy access to films and things like that. One late 2:00 in the morning night at my house, I came across a small film called Entropy. It was playing on Showtime at 2:00 in the morning. And the film starred Stephen Dorff as he was a sort of an up-and-coming filmmaker getting his opportunity to do his big first studio picture. Along the way, he meets a supermodel. They fall in love. The sort of the strains of trying to do this film with a lot of studio interference sort of wears on the relationship, and they sort of fall apart. And the film was a very independent movie that was very notable for the fact that U2, the band, was featured in the film, and Bono has a few scenes where he plays himself. So the film, like I said, it's called Entropy, and I saw it that one time and couldn't find it again for 5 or 6 years, and it was a movie I just absolutely fell in love with. So, we all have that movie we connect with that others haven't seen, and it's sort of your special film. If you find it, you'll watch it no matter what. So let's go back to November of 2015. Now, by that time, I've had writer-director Jim Hemphill on the show a couple times to do the Boogie Nights retrospective and to talk about his career. So he sends me an email in November of 2015 and basically says, hey, Dana, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. His name is Phil Joannou. He's got a new movie coming out starring Jessica Alba and Thomas Jane called The Veil. And this is one of those emails where he attaches my address and Phil's address. So Phil's reading this email at the same time. And I start to correspond with Phil, and Phil graciously sends me a copy of this movie. It hasn't been released yet, and I really like it. I really like the movie. It was a supernatural thriller, and it was 90 minutes, and I thought it was really good. So I asked Phil if he would come on the show, which is very rare, by the way. If anyone who's been listening to my show knows that I don't have a lot of filmmakers on my show, especially ones that don't have big movies out. Does that make sense? Right. So here's me getting ready to interview Phil, and I'm like, well, I better do my due diligence. I better, look at some of the other work that he's done. And I start going through his IMDb credits, and my eyes are just like completely wide. I can't believe some of the movies this guy's made. He did the U2 concert documentary, U2 Rattle and Hum, that was really popular in the 80s. He did a movie called State of Grace that has Gary Oldman, Sean Penn in it. He did the Gridiron Gang with The Rock. He's done a number of big films. He was discovered by Steven Spielberg. And wouldn't you know it, he was the writer and director of Entropy, this small little independent film that I fell in love with that I never talked about to anyone because you couldn't find it anywhere. And come to find out that it was 90% autobiographical, his life. And so through the power of my podcast, I was able to interview the man who made the movie that I fell in love with that I would have never have met ever. And to me, that was kind of one of the big turning points for my show. Like that was one of those, like, this is one of the cooler moments of my life. Like this is, and he's since been on the show 6 times, and we still correspond with each other via email all the time. Like, he's become an acquaintance of mine, and it's just been, that's been one of the greatest moments of my show.
That is such a cool story. That is, I hope most of people who podcast can point to a story or two along those lines, if you will, something that came about that really sort of made this all worth it, if it makes sense. And that's a tremendous opportunity to be able to create a connection with somebody that you unknowingly admired for such a long time.
No, but that's been one of the cooler moments of the show, like I said. But there's also sort of a negative side to that. And that is, and I'm just going to be very open about this, and that is, if I receive any negative feedback about my show, it is that people tend to like the film history and the personal anecdotes substantially more than the interviews, which to me has always been a little bit unnerving for me, because I really like to do the interviews, but they don't seem to get the same response as the film history and the personal anecdotes. So that's why there's been sort of less interviews as of lately. So that I can't explain.
As somebody who makes their hay with interviews, I actually can understand it. And I think the reason why is that I think it's a contrast, right? It sort of came back to what we were talking about earlier about the different pieces of a particular show and kind of evolving them into a formula that works. I described mine with my semi-alternating formats. And the reason that I still do those recommendation shows was because it sort of created that change of pace. And I think that the change of pace, I hope, is beneficial, but I'm also running the risk that somebody may not want that change of pace. And I think that's sort of what people may or may not be responding to with the interviews, is that, we all set a sort of expectation of our listeners, and kind of this unspoken contract, right? Where every single time it appears in their player, they have an anticipation of what they're about to hear. And I sometimes think that if that's different, then you may see, some backlash on that. And I believe that a majority of listeners to How Is This Movie, as well as to my show as well, appreciate the variety, can understand it more in the big scope of what the show is trying to accomplish. And I don't think those people would even reach out. I think what you could be seeing are people who drop in, or people who may not be as invested in the course of How Is This Movie as many of us are.
That's actually a very good way to look at it. And I might add that the feedback was always very passive-aggressive. Nothing ever mean was ever said, anything like that. So
passive-aggressive feedback. You got to love that.
Oh, absolutely. And I read into it really well, too. The tweets sort of like, hey, Dana, so what's the next movie you're covering? Soon, I hope. Things like that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, social media. Well, there's more to get to, and there's kind of a page-turning new chapter that you're going to be embarking on that I'm going to ask you about. But first, folks, I'd like to just take a quick break here and tell you guys about this week's show sponsor. You may have heard him. I've been talking about him. Yes, it is Podbean is back again. And if you are a podcast listener, super fan like myself, or you're also a podcaster already, Podbean's got something for you. It can help you get your show in a much better place. It'll help you start it out. It'll help you take it to the next level. They can get quality embeddable players for your show right on your webpage. What you don't have a webpage, you can get one through Podbean. They've got blog-like sites. You can customize the themes and the colors. You can automatically share your new episodes onto all the socials, all the Twitters and the Facebooks. All is available right there. Of course, full RSS and iTunes support. And you can import and redirect the show if you are coming from somewhere else. You can get an app for both Android and iOS. On Podbean's website, they've got an online directory and all kinds of promotional opportunities for shows that host with them. And of course, comprehensive stats, guys. Stats. We were just, Dana and I were just talking about stats, and stats are a big deal for a podcaster, and you can get all the stats you want with Podbean. They've even got integrated monetization tools, guys. You can make certain episodes as premium. You have an advertising platform if you're interested in bringing on an advertiser for your show, or even its own patron program. All of that's available through Podbean. So if you're a podcaster potentially looking for a new home, or if you are thinking about jumping in the boat with Dana and I and starting your own show, I would encourage you to check out Podbean. In fact, if you go to podbean.com/TPD, you're going to get your first month free, and you can read more and more about some of the things that I've been telling you about. So check them out if you want to take your podcast to the next level. My thanks to Podbean for once again supporting the Podcast Digest. So, Dana, let's talk about your new chapter I've been alluding to. Some big news on the horizon, and I know you've talked about it a little bit publicly, but not too much. But fill folks in on what we're describing here.
Well, I've already officially announced that I have a new podcast coming out called History in the Moment, which shares the same letters as How Is This Movie, which that was done on purpose. So HITM, History in the Moment, which will be somewhat like How Is This Movie in its format as far as the film history aspect is concerned. I am going to be covering a lot of different historical events, a lot of different history-making moments, if you will. And then I'm going to do very, very long, in-depth retrospectives on things, which I'm going to be launching with the first episode, which will be on the exhaustive history of MTV. Now, the reason why I picked MTV is, and we did talk about this the first time I was on the interview, is for many, many years I was a DJ, like yourself. And I share an enormous passion for all things music, which I don't really get to talk about on How Was This Movie. And so given the opportunity to sort of talk about a network that sort of helped to shape music culture for, well, I'll say the first 20 years of its existence, was really important to me, and I really wanted to talk a lot about that. Now, what I don't think I was initially prepared for when I announced that MTV was going to be the first topic of the first episode was the actual amount of history that I was going to uncover. This goes all the way back to the 1950s for me. This story is going to start back with the payola scandals of the 1950s, where very prominent DJs and even Dick Clark were accused of taking bribes from the record companies to play certain music, to make certain music popular. And I've sort of uncovered a trend that continued up until almost to this day, where that sort of still goes on. So what's turned into a historical retrospective of MTV has turned into even more some investigative journalism.
Boy.
And so I'm really on to something here. I just have to ask for all those where I said it was going to launch early November. Just please be patient with me. It's happening. There are notes. There are pages and pages and pages of notes. There is outlines been typed. It's going to happen. It's probably going to be at least a 5-part episode, with each part being an hour long, just to give you an idea of how big this is going to be. So this is not going to be the 30-minute, How Is This Movie quick episode. These are going to be more in-depth. And I'm going to talk about everything. I'm going to talk about the Kennedy assassination, about Watergate, about Michael Jackson. I mean, just all the historical things that I'm interested in. I'm hoping that people will also be interested in hearing my take on these topics as I sort of tell the story behind the story of all these different historical events.
It's like a Dana Buckler twist on stuff you missed in history class.
That's exact. Yeah. Yes. That's one way to look at it. Yes.
And I think it's a great concept, because it's sort of like, we were not to beat the dead horse at this point, like we were talking about with the personal stories. It allows you to get your voice into other areas than just film or film history, right? Which I think is awesome. And I think a lot of people are really going to enjoy this. I mean, I know I'll be subscribing as soon as it comes out. And I'm sorry, I did not know you to actually shared this publicly. Why? Because you've been talking about it on Patreon, of which I'm a supporter, and folks, you guys should be supporting Dana on Patreon as well. And I know you've been talking about it there. I wasn't sure how public out this new launch was.
Well, it was only in one. I did the every time I do a Patreon exclusive episode, and there are 6 bonus exclusive episodes on the Patreon page, And there are 5 what I call HITM archived episodes, and that's some episodes, including one I know you're a fan of, the Pulp Fiction episode is up on the Patreon page. And I'm going to be putting more episodes into the HITM vault, if you will, as I get more episodes on the main feed. But every time I do a special bonus exclusive episode, I always sort of release like a 4 or 5 minute preview of that episode on the main feed, so people can kind of hear what the tone of that episode is. And when I released the Goonies preview episode, I mentioned History in the Moment, but I haven't talked about it again since then because I've been kind of...
Was it a post? I remember a conversation going on, and I don't even know where I hit it now, and this sort of segues greatly into my next question, which was the name origin. Wasn't it on Patreon? You were asking for name suggestions or what have you?
Oh, I put that on Twitter. Yeah,
on Twitter. Maybe I saw that on Twitter.
I said,
talk to me about the name selection. You said it was done on purpose, but what's that process like?
Well, so I've always liked the HITM. I've always liked the HITM. I really have. And I've sort of kind of put everything sort of into this basket of, well, I like the HITM. I'd like to get a network eventually, sort of the HITM Podcast Network, where everything is sort of HITM. So I put it out there that I'm doing a podcast on history, and I would like for the followers to help me come up with the name of my show. And History in the Making was the one that I think 80% of the people mentioned. They said, "Oh, you should do History in the Making." Unfortunately, that one's already taken.
Right.
I looked it up. I've already looked it up. And then my friend Nick G, who hosts a podcast, a great podcast called the Independent Dependent Podcast, he sort of helped me sort of reel it in and say, you know what, I think History in the Moment is going to be the best option to go with, because there was a whole bunch of them out there. Some of them just didn't even make any sense, but they were just people just sort of attaching a word to each letter, and I was like, oh, thank you, I appreciate that, but I don't even know what that means. So we're just gonna. And then to his credit, he also helped me design the logo for it, which is up on the Patreon and the Twitter page as well. So I have to give a shout out to Nick G, my friend. Sorry, I hope I know he's listening. So
perfect. Well, now we at least know one person will be listening, right, Dan?
Sure.
So here's the question. You mentioned the exhaustive effort that's coming up with this, first round of episodes with the history-based show. How are you going to manage both of these?
Well, and I hope people will understand that the history one is going to be a once a month episode.
Makes sense.
So once a month. Not really the case with the MTV one, because there's going to be a lot of work involved, and this is a good tip for anybody that wants to start a podcast. Whenever you're going to release a new podcast to iTunes or any way via your RSS feed, it's always a good idea to have more than one episode available. I think I've read that to have 3-4 episodes available. So I'm going to have all 5 episodes ready when that launches. So wow. I was reading a tip that said that it's better to have more than one episode sort of launched at the same time. We're going to find out whether or not that's true.
Okay. I think I've heard the same thing. I think there are 2 schools of thought there. The idea is obviously that can bulk up your download numbers, and it's something about the delta of previous downloads to new downloads, along with subscriber and review counts, that can get you featured or charted. So that's one of the reasons I think people will do multiple drops of it. But I think there's a downside to it potentially.
I'm all ears.
Which is the only thing I would worry about is people potentially skipping the first couple, right? And let's say somebody who has their podcast player, as I do, putting the most recent episode at the top, could potentially jump into episode 5 and say, that's not for me, and then leave it, when really what they should have done was start at 1, and you could skew download numbers that you may actually see them either high or low depending on which end. Somebody who may start on 1 and not have the stamina, if you will, to make it through a full 5. So there is benefit, I've come to understand, in doing it that way. You also get the Netflix binge effect, right?
Exactly.
Where the whole thing is there. But there are some risks, and I don't think it's necessarily everything's a pro-con, right? That's one of my favorite expressions. There's good and bad that's going to come with either approach to take. And the other thing, too, is that you want to then make sure everything is locked in, right? Because if people start listening to one and give you feedback that you could have put in 4 or 5, but it's already out there, that type of thing.
You know what? You bring up some very, very valid points. And again, these are all just ideas that I've got churning around in my head, but I can, this is all the sort of the dilemma for the launch of the first episodes. But again, I plan on making this about a once a month release where the episodes will be probably 90 minutes in length versus the 30-minute one. But you're right. I have some tough decisions ahead of me on how to launch this. Thankfully, I have some experience as far as the actual art of putting the podcast together now versus when I first launched this show, which, oh boy, that was a nightmare. Anyway, but that was a long time ago. So
a lot of learning, that's for sure. Well, and so is it safe to assume then, with that being the schedule, eventually a monthly release for History in the Moment, that big fans of How This Movie won't necessarily see an impact on that show due to the launch of the new one?
No, I don't think that's going to be an issue. I think most people have realized that it's really once every 2 weeks that I'm releasing episodes of How Is This Movie versus back in the sort of the early first year and a half, I was churning them out a week at a time. I mean, one every week. Whereas I've taken, the reality is that just my job, my real job, if you will, just takes up so much of my time that I usually spend one weekend researching the topic and then the following weekend sort of recording and producing the episode. And that actually gives me a little bit more, for lack of a better term, quality of life with my days off. Because what was happening when I was releasing episodes every week is the 1 or possibly 2 days off in a row that I would have were so swallowed up by everything that I was doing that it was like, oh wait, football season's over. Wait, when
that just happened?
Wait, when did that? Yeah, wait. No, so that I was realizing that if I didn't take some time just to relax and do nothing, so I'll spend 5 hours and then I'll do nothing for the rest of the day, and then the next week I'll spend 6 hours producing the episode. So, yeah, will I add a little bit more to my work schedule with the new podcast? Absolutely. But it's something I really, really want to do, and it's something I'm excited to do. So, time will tell to see, if it stays monthly or, if the How of This Movie is affected. But right now, I don't think it will be. That's
awesome.
That's where I'm at right now.
And a lot of it's putting together a plan, right, and making sure that you can actually do this. I don't think I've shared this on this show before, but listening to your tale of setup and launch of this, it potentially motivates me. But I've had gestating inside of me an idea for a second show of my own for months now. I mean, I've gone this far, Dana. I've bought the domain. I've signed up for the Twitter account. I've got an email address for it. I've locked all of it in. I've even put a request out for, an artist, a friend of mine that I know, to help with the artwork. Actually, the guy who did the artwork for the Podcast Digest, and say, hey, look, maybe, could you start thinking about this? But I just have no idea on how to put it together in terms of time, because this other idea I have would not be the Podcast Digest. It would not be a simple interview show that I use a fraction of the time that you do with How's This Movie or History, or many of the other show producers out there. I mean, this is a very easy show to produce as compared to so many others. And the idea that I have would be a much tougher go of it. And so it encourages me, with somebody with a busy schedule like yourself, that you've been able to put this together and it will see the light of day. It encourages me to maybe take a second look. If
there was one thing that I could take back, I would have, and this is just being very, very honest, I would have withheld the announcement of the new show. I would have waited until, I had affirmed, like, this is the day I'm recording it. And I might have even waited until the episode was actually done and then spent a week or two sort of promoting the launch of it. But because what I've done is I've just put undue stress on myself. Like, oh, you've already announced it. Now you have to do this. You have to do this. Yep. I think I had to take a sort of a long look at myself the other day and say, you know what? If you rush this, you're going to have the same results that you did when you first launched How Is This Movie? And that is nobody was listening because the quality wasn't there. And so I just ask people to please be patient. I promise it will be out soon.
I bet it will be worth the wait, I'm sure. Let's talk about any other ideas percolated in your head for the future. And I just want to point out something that you have tried a little bit, and I've enjoyed the contributions of, and check and see if there's anything else there. You've done a little bit of HITM YouTube, yes?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have. Some really, fun stuff. Some stuff not as good as I could have done. I'll start with that. So I had an idea. I had sort of a grandiose idea of launching a YouTube channel, sort of a video version of How Was This Movie? And I fell back into the whole, I announced it before it was ready, and I produced 2 episodes of the show, and I released them, and I don't even have them anymore. That's how cringe-inducing they were for me.
Wow.
But again, this falls back into the old, I really want to do it. I want to get this done. And I thought I had a great idea, and I rushed it into production and could have done a much better job on it. And I recognize that now. And so now I've sort of taken a step back and said, well, instead of trying to do a 30-minute on-camera, show like Entertainment Tonight, which that's literally what I was trying to do. And let's go back sort of the root of what do you do with How Is This Movie? What's one of the best things that you do? You sort of inform people about things they may not have known. And that's kind of one of my favorite things about doing How Is This Movie is sort of telling people the stuff they didn't know. Like when you go to the Aliens movie, for example, you realize that James Cameron was in the offices of 2 producers who were pitching him on writing a script for Spartacus II to be set in space. And this is a real thing. And when he kind of said, guys, thanks, I'm not really interested, he got up to walk out the door, and they said, oh, by the way, we also want to do a sequel to Ridley Scott's Alien. You might be interested in that? And that's how the genesis of James Cameron coming on board Aliens, the movie Aliens, was. So, I mean, those are the kind of things I love to tell on my show. So with this YouTube thing, this YouTube channel I have now I want to do sort of the same thing, but in a much more condensed version. So I did produce a video called 5 Movie Sequels You Didn't Know Existed. And that was one of the funnest things to research, because it's like, okay, let's see. Only one of the movies that is talked about in that YouTube video I actually knew existed. That was sort of where I got the idea, and that was for The Jerk 2. Remember the Steve Martin movie, The Jerk?
Right. Mm-hmm.
I didn't know there was a sequel. I mean, I knew there was a sequel, but I didn't realize that. Let me do that again, Dan. Sorry. I'm sorry. Was The Jerk 2. And that was the only one that I knew existed. And so when I was sort of researching other sequels, I'm like, I didn't know there was a sequel to A Christmas Story. I didn't know there was a sequel to The Talented Mr. Ripley. These are movies. And so I put together this little 5-minute video, and I got a lot of great feedback. And so that's kind of the avenue that I'm going to go down, is every once in a while, when the inspiration hits me right, I'll take a day and I'll produce the video, because it took me about 8 hours to make that video. So I sort of have a template on how long it will take to put one of those videos together. But I'm not going to go week to week like I am with the podcast, or month to month. It's just sort of when the inspiration hits me right, I'm going to do one.
What would be interesting is, with history in the moment, there could be, I'm thinking about MTV, right? Or some of those other events you talked about, like the JFK assassination or Michael Jackson. There's such a visual element to some of those. Wouldn't it be neat to overlay a part of the episode's narration over some of the visuals you're referencing and release it as a YouTube video?
I think that's a fantastic idea. And it's going through the back of my mind. Do you have any idea how long that would take? I'm just going.
Well, I'm thinking to myself, if you repurposed, part of the episode already, right, and just literally cut out, a 5-minute segment, there's your audio already for YouTube, and it's just a matter of locating the visuals and stringing them together.
No, you're absolutely correct, and I'll actually put the call out there if anybody's interested in helping me to do that, because I think that's a fantastic idea. Hey, Dan,
It would be
off the record, we should talk about this.
I am not that guy. I'll tell you what, I dabbled in YouTube in the early 2000s, like I think every one of us did at one point. I have now since hid all those videos. They're all marked private now because they were such a joke. And, technically the Podcast Digest is out on YouTube, but it's just the audio only version.
Can I say something about YouTube, though, which is one thing that why I've been more hesitant to pull the trigger on more videos on YouTube versus the podcast, and that is feedback. And
YouTube comments, the internet cesspool.
And throughout the 3 years of How Was This Movie, again, I cannot tell you, actually, when I say I cannot tell you, because you completely understand. There's no greater feeling than when somebody takes the time to reach out to you on social media or via email to tell you that they really liked what you did, that they really enjoyed what you did, that it put a smile on their face, or they just really enjoyed it. They're now a subscriber, and they're telling their friends, and they're retweeting your tweets, and you're creating sort of a community, and it's the most empowering thing about what we do. It's the most motivating thing. It's what keeps us going. In my opinion, it's what keeps us going. You want to keep doing more because your people are really letting you know how much they enjoy their work. That's the total opposite with YouTube. Okay?
Exactly.
I had to disable comments on 3 of my videos because I just don't even know where these people are coming from. And it's interesting because they're anonymous, but the comments are just to the point where I don't even want to deal with them anymore. So there's another reason why I've been sort of hesitant to jump, headfirst into the YouTube community, because I think it's the comments are almost done for sport these days.
I would agree.
It's something I can't wrap my head around.
There's a brazenness given by the internet and the granting of anonymity to a lot of stupid people, and I think it's run amok and has for a lot of years.
And I just don't find that in the podcast listener community. I think that I've mentioned this on previous episodes. I received a 2-star review on iTunes, and it kept me up at night for a day or two, because I was like, what did I do wrong? And it took another podcaster who hosts a really popular film podcast. I reached out to him and said, how did you handle the first negative review that you got? He goes, I lost my mind. And he goes, but then I realized that, for that one negative review, you've got 50 positive reviews. And why are you not focusing on the positive ones? Why are you letting one person's opinion really bring you down? Yeah. So it's very rare in the podcast community, and in YouTube, it's very blatant, and it's the norm. So I just don't think it's something I think I could psychologically handle with how busy my schedule is.
Yeah, it's been a common string of conversation here on this show that I've asked many hosts and creators about, the concept of, what putting your work out there and then having it, taken down, if you will, a notch by somebody who, basically has no right in doing it. It's one of the reasons that I've never reviewed a podcast to trash it, right? In my I do a recommendation episode. I don't say, and stay away from these 2 pieces of garbage, because who am I to take somebody else's effort and, trample upon it? And I think that's important. I have a big belief that if you don't like something, the internet, YouTube, the podcasts and iTunes is full of millions of other options. Just go somewhere else. Watch something else. Listen to something else. Find something you do like. You don't need to take the time to tell somebody about how you didn't like something. Especially for something that's free. You're not paying for the YouTube video. You're not paying for the podcast, okay? It's something you got and chose to watch or listen to for free. If you order something from a restaurant and it's a complete crap, that's a different thing. Maybe you should tell somebody because you paid for it. But you didn't pay to watch that video or listen to that podcast. It drives me crazy.
And it's interesting you say that, because if any of the Patreon supporters that I have were to contact me and have an issue with one of the bonus episodes, I would listen. I would say
exactly.
I would
you
listen.
look at it a lot differently.
I would look at it completely different. Say, okay, what was it about this episode that I could have done better? Because you know what, in this particular case, they are supporting those episodes.
Exactly.
So
and that's coming from a good place, right?
Exactly.
Somebody who's been signed up with you for 6 months and giving you X dollars already, that's coming from a good place. If you hear something negative from them, they're not doing it to hurt your feelings, to take you down a notch. It's legitimate constructive criticism, hopefully.
Exactly. And I would be open to it, and I would not be offended. I would listen to it, and I would make whatever changes I thought were necessary to improve any situation that were to come up. But you make a great valid point, though, with the podcast and especially the YouTube. You're right. It is free. What do we do? Oh, so you have to watch a 15-second video before the YouTube video starts? I mean, this is crazy.
We'll take that up with YouTube, right?
Yeah. Sign up for YouTube Red.
It drives me crazy. I had somebody just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm not going to say who it was or even what they said, but they put some public Twitter criticism out there on how I conducted a recent interview, and I read it and fumed about it for about 10 minutes, and then I just let it go. And actually, what I did was try to basically kill him with kindness. I replied and I said, "I'm very sorry you didn't enjoy this, but I appreciate you listening." And ironically enough, it actually resulted into a back and forth at the end where the person said, "No, I really love what you do. It was just this," and ended up it was an actual regular listener. But it's almost that thing that's like, well, if you have something to mention, shoot me an email, DM me. Okay, why are you taking this out into the public, as some type of unfounded criticism that I could have, cleared up for you the confusion you apparently had well in advance, and I wouldn't have had that 10 minutes of irritation.
I received an email from someone who said that they were a regular listener who was really upset that I decided to put my episodes behind a paywall. And I have not wrote this person back yet because I'm not exactly sure how to handle this. And I'd be interested to hear how other listeners that have Patreon pages, if they've dealt with the same situation where this person basically said, and I'm paraphrasing, that they were a regular listener of the show and they feel like I'm taking away the essence of podcasting by putting some episodes behind what they said was a paywall. And I'd be curious to hear what other people think about that. I mean, my donation system set up for Patreon is you can donate any amount you want. You're going to gain access to the episodes. You can do $1 a month if you'd like. And it's just a way to sort of help cover the operating costs of the show and, of the new podcast. So I'm just wondering if you ever heard anybody sort of have that situation before.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of people. There are. What's funny is for an industry that's barely, 10 years old or so, or 12 years old in its earliest form, they're almost these podcast purists, right? And some of them, when I launched a Patreon or, I've now started to feature an advertiser, you get these people who think, oh, all podcasting should be free and it should always be free. And I don't understand why this has to be there, that has to be there. Now, these are sort of very idealistic people, I think, because, for the rest of us realists, understand, especially, let's use your show, Dana, as a perfect example. You're talking about the hours and hours and hours of research. These things don't create themselves. Right. And if the only thing Dana's looking to accomplish in this process is to at least get, the hosting and a new microphone every 2 years cost covered, I don't think that's too much to ask when you're spending, dozens of hours of research and writing and recording and narration. Because if for some reason somebody like Dana loses his motivation to do this, the show goes away.
Yeah.
Right.
No, you're right.
You don't get to hear it anymore. So I feel that if you or anyone else wants to do any of these things, start a Patreon, put episodes, that are accessible by cost. And in terms of that, I'll point you to Mark Maron or Answer Me This or all these people who are selling their back catalogs, the Earwolf stuff and Howl and .fm and all this stuff. People are trying to make sure these creative ventures keep going. There are membership sites, whether it be Gimlet or Relay FM or Radiotopia with their annual pledge drives. It's because these things cost money.
Yeah, that's the thing is they cost money, and in a lot of cases, and you touched on it, there's a ton of sweat equity put into the shows. Doesn't matter. I don't know anyone that does a podcast that doesn't, if they record the episode, they don't just immediately post it online. I mean, there is some fine tuning and some touches you have to do, even to the what you think is going to be the simplest podcast. There is work that has to be done. And that work is, guess what? You're not getting paid for that work.
Yep.
So, but again, these are just, again, we're talking about sort of feedback and things like that. And that was just sort of, I think I'm going to do exactly what you did. I'm going to take the high road and I'm going to say, listen, I really appreciate the fact that you've been a listener. This is just something we're doing. The main show is not going away. This is just some added bonus content to sort of help generate a little bit of revenue just to keep things the way they are and maybe even grow the show a little bit.
Yeah. And, that's the way I look at it, and I try to do the kill him with kindness thing right there because, if this were to get ugly, I always want to be the one who handled it right, and so good luck on the reply on that one, Dana.
Oh, thank you.
But if somebody wants to find all of the stuff that we've been talking about, tell them where they can find all of the great Dana Buckler productions.
Okay, so I'll start by saying that How Is This Movie is available wherever podcasts can be found, because I think we just spend too much time going over all the individual apps. You mentioned this show you have it sponsored by Podbean. You can certainly find How Is This Movie on Podbean. You can find it on Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, all the main podcast applications. If anybody wants to follow the show on Twitter, the Twitter handle for the show is @HowIsThisMovie, and that will become the Twitter page for both shows. I figure by this point, Dan, I don't think I want to just start another Twitter page. I think I'll just use.
I'm with you.
I'll use the one Twitter page to handle both. So
yeah, I don't even use my personal page. I just use all the show because I don't want to deal with 2 pages.
Exactly. If you want to follow the show on Facebook, it's facebook.com/howisthismovie. If anybody ever wants to email me with show suggestions, and believe me, I love getting show suggestions. Because that usually, sometimes I'll be stuck in a little bit of a rut, like, what do I do next? I need something to grab me. And then I got an email from a young lady named Holly who said, you should really do Aliens. I love that movie. You should do the Aliens because I love this scene. I love this scene. And the light bulb went off. I'm like, yes, absolutely. And I did Aliens 2 days later. I mean, so if you want to email me at HITMpodcast@gmail.com, please send me the show suggestions. You never know. I in some cases, you might get an episode 2 days after you email me. If you get,
oh, now you're making promises.
No. There's a slight possibility, and I'm just going to leave it at that.
There's a historical precedent to say that.
Yes, it has happened once before.
Exactly. Well, folks, please go do all of that, and especially follow them on Twitter, because if that's going to share both shows, you're going to want to follow along when the new one comes along. It sounds like it's going to be awesome. So I will be subscribing, listening, following, doing all those things. As I mentioned, it will be a permanent fixture in my podcast player, Dana, that's for sure. So Dana Buckler, thank you very much for taking the time to join me, man.
Dan, thank you again. And I just want to say that you have been one of the biggest supporters of what I do since the inception of your show. And I cannot thank you enough for all that you've done, not just for myself, but sort of getting the word out about all of the amazing podcasts that are out there. And I got to tell you, there's been a couple times when I've got your show in my feed, and a couple hosts that you've had on there have been that holy blank moment, like, oh my, I can't believe he's going to be talking to this person, and I'm so excited to listen to it. So thank you for everything you've done to help support my show. Thank you for everything you've done to help support podcasting as I think a very recognizable, viable form of entertainment now. So just thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure being on your show. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate all that as well, Dana. It's my pleasure, and I hope, folks, if you did enjoy this episode of the Podcast Digest, in addition to all the subscribing, liking, following with HITM, I also want you to tell somebody about the Podcast Digest. If you really support the show, we've been discussing Patreon. There is a link in the show notes for the Podcast Digest and the Patreon page there. And also don't want you to forget that if you're considering starting a podcast, or you already have one and looking for a new home, this week's show was brought to you by Podbean. Podbean. Go to podbean.com/TPD. That'll get you your first month free and give you a whole bunch more information. Also, tell them that you came from the Podcast Digest, and I very much appreciate it. So, folks, that will do it for episode 118 of the Podcast Digest. Come back again next week for another great interview. Until then, my name is Dan Lizette.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter @PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.